I've never said this out loud before. Not to my family, not to my therapist, and yes, I have one for reasons that will become obvious. Not to anyone who knew me during those 15 years when I lived, essentially, two completely separate lives. One life was normal, embarrassingly normal. I had a job, I paid taxes, I helped my neighbor carry groceries, I went to birthday parties and made small talk and complained about the weather like everyone else. The other life existed in a place most people have heard of, but very few actually understand. A place with no rules, no identity, no consequences, or so I believed for a very long time. The Darknet. I'm not going to tell you this story to shock you. I'm telling it because I spent 15 years watching what that world does to people, what it did to me, and I think the version of it that exists in public conversation is so wrong, so dangerously simplified, that it's actually making people less safe. So here's the truth. All of it. Nobody's first day on the Darknet is dramatic. Mine was a Tuesday afternoon in 2007. I was 23, working a dead-end IT support job, and I'd read an article about Tor, the onion router, a browser originally developed by the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory to protect intelligence communications. By 2007, it had been released publicly and was being discussed in tech forums as a privacy tool. I downloaded it out of pure curiosity, the same curiosity that makes people Google things they'd never say out loud, the same curiosity that is, at its core, completely human. The first thing I found was forums, people discussing censorship, government surveillance, political dissidents, journalists protecting sources, activists in authoritarian countries communicating safely. This was, and still is, the legitimate use case for Darknet infrastructure, and it's documented extensively by organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and Reporters Without Borders. I want to be honest about this part because it matters. The Darknet is not inherently criminal. The technology is neutral. What people do with it is not. And here's where my story starts to get uncomfortable. Because once you're inside a space with no rules and no visibility, once you realize that nobody can see you and nothing is traceable back to your real identity, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, gradually. The way your eyes adjust to darkness until you can see things you couldn't see before. Within 6 months, I had moved from privacy forums into spaces I had no business being in. Here's something that will reframe everything you think you know about the Darknet. It has an economy, a sophisticated, surprisingly well-organized one. In 2011, 4 years into my time there, a marketplace called Silk Road launched and changed everything. Built by Ross Ulbricht, who operated under the name Dread Pirate Roberts, Silk Road used Bitcoin for transactions and Tor for anonymity to create what was essentially an Amazon for illegal goods. By the time the FBI shut it down in 2013, it had processed an estimated $1.2 billion in transactions. I was there for all of it. Not as a buyer of the most serious things, I want to be precise about what I'm admitting to, but as someone who existed in that ecosystem, who used those markets, who told himself that what he was doing was low-level enough to not really count. That rationalization, the idea that there's a hierarchy of harm and you're safely near the bottom, is the most dangerous thought you can have in that world, because the hierarchy doesn't work the way you think it does. Every transaction, every participation, every moment of engagement feeds the same infrastructure. I understood this intellectually. I ignored it anyway, for years. The specific things I'm ashamed of I'm going to be honest about without being gratuitous. I bought substances I shouldn't have. I participated in forums where information was shared that caused real harm to real people I never saw. I used anonymity as permission, as a moral off switch, and I kept using it that way because nobody stopped me and nothing bad happened to me personally. That last part is important. The absence of consequence is not the same as the absence of harm. 7 years in, 2014,
I was on a forum, one of the larger ones, the kind that had moderators and rules and a strange veneer of community, when someone posted something that I can't describe in detail here, something involving a child. I closed the browser, physically pushed back from my desk, and sat there for a very long time. Because here's what that moment exposed. I had spent 7 years constructing a mental architecture in which the Darknet was a separate world, with separate rules and separate consequences. A video game, a thought experiment, something that existed in a different moral dimension than the one where I helped my neighbor with her groceries. That post demolished the architecture in about 4 seconds. There was a child, a real one, and the ecosystem I had been comfortably inhabiting that I had told myself was mostly harmless, mostly philosophical, mostly just edgy adults making edgy choices, was the same ecosystem that produced and distributed that image. I didn't report it. That's one of the things I carry. The reporting mechanism for child sexual abuse material online in the United States is the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's Cyber Tip Line, a federally mandated system that receives millions of reports annually. I didn't know that then. Or maybe I did know and used not knowing as an excuse. I'm honestly not sure which is worse. I stayed away for 3 months after that. Then I went back. This is the part that I think is most useful and most misunderstood. The question everyone wants to ask is, why didn't you just stop? You had a normal life, you had options. Why keep going back to something that was clearly corroding you? The answer has 3 parts, and none of them are satisfying. First, identity. By year 7 or 8, a significant part of how I understood myself was built around what I knew, the technical knowledge, the navigation skills, the insider familiarity with a world most people couldn't access. Leaving meant dismantling a version of myself I had spent years constructing. Psychologists who study extremist group disengagement, researchers like Dr. John Horgan at Georgia State University, identify this identity entanglement as one of the primary barriers to exit across all forms of underground community membership. Second, the normalization gradient. When you move through a space incrementally, each new level feels like a small step from the last one. By the time you're somewhere genuinely dark, you've lost the external reference point that would tell you how far you've traveled. I didn't have anyone in my regular life who knew where I'd been, so I had no mirror. And third, and this is the one that's hardest to admit, parts of it felt like community. The Darknet, at its less criminal edges, had people who were genuinely intelligent, genuinely interesting, genuinely engaged with ideas about privacy, power, and freedom that mainstream platforms weren't equipped to handle. That legitimate intellectual engagement existed alongside deeply harmful content in the same spaces, and I used the former to justify my proximity to the latter. That's the trap. That's how it works. And it works on people who are not stupid and not inherently bad. It worked on me for 15 years. In 2022, a federal indictment was unsealed in my city related to a darknet marketplace I had used years earlier. 3 people were arrested. Their names were in the news. Their faces were in the news. One of them I recognized, not personally, but from a username, someone I had interacted with casually over years, someone whose handle I associated with relatively mundane forum activity, was now facing federal charges that detailed conduct I hadn't known about and genuinely hadn't suspected. That's the thing about anonymity. It works in all directions. You don't know who you're really talking to. You don't know what the person on the other side of a transaction is actually doing with what you've given them. You construct a version of them that feels safe, and you proceed on that construction, and sometimes the federal indictment tells you how wrong you were. I deleted everything that week, not out of fear of being caught. My own activity, while genuinely shameful, had stayed below the threshold that attracts federal attention, but out of a specific, clarifying disgust with myself that I had been waiting 15 years to feel fully. I told my therapist 6 months later. It took 4 sessions to get the full story out. She said something I've thought about every day since. The shame kept you in longer than the curiosity brought you in. She was right. The shame of what I had already done made leaving feel impossible, because leaving meant confronting it. Staying meant I could keep not looking directly at it. That logic, that the worse things get, the harder it is to stop, is not unique to the darknet. It's addiction architecture. It's the same reason people stay in situations that are destroying them long after the exit door appears. I'm telling you this because I think the public conversation about the darknet is broken in a specific way. It swings between two poles. Either it's a boogeyman full of hitmen and terrorists that only criminals use, or it's a misunderstood privacy tool unfairly demonized by governments that want to surveil everyone. The truth is more complicated and more human. The darknet is a space where the removal of consequence changes people, gradually, invisibly, in ways they don't notice until they're looking back at a decade and a half and